The proceeding will start shortly. 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 The proceeding will start shortly.
Order. Welcome to this evidence session for the Home Affairs Select Committee, and we're taking evidence today on extremism and counter-terrorism. We welcome in our first panel our first witness, Sara, the lead commissioner for the Commission for Countering Extremism. Welcome.
Good morning.
Very good to have you before us today. Could you just begin by just outlining for us what you see as being the current challenges, the most extreme challenges, the challenges in terms of facing extremism, and also the work that you're doing at the moment in response?
Yes, of course. So the Commission itself was established in March 2018, and I was tasked by the then Home Secretary to carry out a strategic assessment of extremism across England and Wales. That resulted in our report, which was published in October last year, called Challenging Hateful Extremism. I was also asked to put forward proposals for a future Commission for Countering Extremism, what role and function it should play. The Commission is the only independent body to review the government's 2015 counter-extremism strategy. Back then we said that there needs to be a complete and urgent overhaul of that strategy. We also highlighted in that report how the work around terrorism...
Sorry to interrupt you. I think we have a technical problem with the sound from the room to our members who are online. So I'm going to let you carry on, but I just want to flag that so that we can try and follow up. So do carry on.
So in the report, what we highlighted was that there's clearly terrorism, and there's a strategy to deal with terrorism in this country. We identified a distinct type of extremist activity in this country, which we are calling hateful extremism. And it's extremist organisations and individuals and groups who are inciting hatred against other people, who are making the moral case for violence, which is based on hateful, hostile, supremacist beliefs and which is causing harm. So very much happy to talk about the report. One of the things that we've also been doing since the publication of that report is looking at COVID, how hateful extremists have been exploiting the pandemic. We've published a report about that in July. I've also commissioned the former head of CT at the Metropolitan Police, Sir Mark Rowley, to lead a legal review into hateful extremism, and that's currently ongoing. And so currently we're also engaging with the government to look at and focus on getting the right counter-extremism policy and infrastructure in this country, and talking about the online harms bill. And I have to say my primary concern and focus really is ensuring that we do have the right counter-extremism machinery in this country, because as this committee knows better than anybody else, we've been having this conversation about extremism for a long time. What we don't have is the right counter-extremism infrastructure to deal with what is now a growing problem in our country.
Thank you. We want to sort of come on to each of those points, to take each of those in turn, to look at both the nature of extremism, your assessment of hateful extremism, and then the response from the government and from the Home Office. We'll start with Ruth Edwards, who I'm hoping can now hear the evidence session. Ruth.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I can. And Sara, I apologise for missing the first part of your remarks. I'm afraid my sound feed cut out. I wanted to ask you about the report you produced last year, which introduced the idea of hateful extremism and called for the counter-extremism strategy to be refocused around this. Could you explain a bit more for us about how you define hateful extremism and how it differs from how we sort of understand other forms of extremism?
So the government's definition of extremism is around the issue of British values. There's been a lot of discussion about that definition. One of the things that we did was carry out a public consultation. We asked the public on what they thought about the government's definition of extremism. How do the public view extremism? What do they describe it as? How do they identify it? We carried out a great deal of evidence for this report. I visited around 20 different towns and cities across England and Wales. We held 16 roundtables with academics, practitioners, critics, people who are very critical of this work as well. We commissioned 19 academic papers. I reviewed data from 10 different government departments and regulators. And so looking at all of that evidence, we came up with this summary and definition of hateful extremism. And when we did the public consultation, we gave all of that data to the Policy Institute at King's College, who looked at it and tried to understand where is there commonality amongst the public in terms of extremism and where there are differences. There's no doubt that there is consensus amongst the public about terrorism. Terrorism is clearly viewed by the public as being extremist. What we then found were that there were overarching themes and that there were consensus around three particular aspects of beliefs, behaviours and harms, which we describe as being the key pillars of hateful extremism. And we found that what we're seeing are the types of things that we've identified in our report, behaviours which are inciting hatred against other people, where there is persistent hatred against individuals who belong to a particular group, often people who have groups of protected characteristics, people who are making the moral case for violence against other people. So when we've seen, for example, people celebrating the acts of suicide bombers or glorifying people like Brenton Tarrant or celebrating people like Thomas Mayer who murdered Joe Cox or celebrating suicide bombers, as I mentioned, that type of behaviour is often not caught by terrorism legislation, but where we felt that there was consensus amongst the public about that type of activity. And I think that type of activity, again, it's interesting because it's not been caught by the threshold of terrorism legislation. It sits beyond hate crime, and it's a distinct type of activity which is not being dealt with effectively. And so that's where we found the greatest consensus amongst the public in terms of definition. And the other interesting finding we found from the Institute of Policy at King's was that often there's this view that you can never get a definition of extremism. There's no doubt that the E word is very much a subjective term and it has been misused, it is often overused, but we found that 95% of the public do believe you can get a definition, you can get consensus on a definition of extremism which can be operational and can deal with these types of harms that we've outlined in our reports.
I think that's really interesting because, of course, there are a number of offences under terrorism legislation which are, connected to glorifying or promoting terrorism. Which particular ones do you think, or which particular sort of acts of extremism, maybe, do you think aren't covered by current legislation, which should be?
So this is actually why we're doing a legal review. One of the recommendations that came out from our report was that we felt, now that we've got this much more tighter definition of hateful extremism, a much more narrow and concise definition, it's now important to carry out a legal review to see and understand whether the law is catching this type of behaviour, where there are gaps in the law, and what the implications are. And so that's why I've appointed Sir Mark Rowley to look at that. We're gathering evidence. There are clearly cases of hateful extremism which we feel are not being captured by either CT legislation or by hate crime legislation or any other type of legislation. And that's something that we definitely want to present to the committee. And I think some of this behaviour is happening online, some of this behaviour is offline. We're seeing examples of people, for example, inciting hatred against Jews as a whole. So if you look at organisations like the British National Socialist Movement, who are a neo-Nazi white supremacist organisation. They are not a proscribed terrorist organisation in this country. They meet the definition for hateful extremism. You can see how some of the language, some of the things that they've been engaging in, for example, on Telegram, they've been encouraging users to deliberately infect Jews and Muslims. And again, it's this idea of targeting groups of people because of their race, their religious identity, Whereas hate crime, for example, will very much look at protecting victims as an individual. So there's a gap where if we look at individuals, for example, Stephen Yaxley Lennon, when he is repeatedly engaging in hatred against Muslims as a whole, it's not a one-off, it's a repeat, persistent pattern of behaviour. When I've spoken to law enforcement agencies, when I've spoken to the CPS, there is clearly, I believe, a gap that when it comes to people engaging in this behaviour against groups of people as a whole, the law is not dealing with this effectively. And so I think that's where I think our findings from the legal review will be really interesting to show that there are currently gaps in our legislation, and behaviour which is currently probably described as being legal should probably be made illegal.
Thank you. And just one final question. You mentioned the online spread, and you mentioned the Telegram as well. How did you look at the role of online platforms and messaging services, and probably the propagation of fake news as well, in terms of the spread of hateful extremism and the ideas around that? Did you make any assessments of that role?
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, I don't think we can talk about extremism, modern day extremism, without talking about the threats of online extremism, and we're continuing to do that as part of the legal review. I mean, just to give you a flavour of the type of challenges that I regularly see in my role. I mean, if you just take one social media platform such as 4chan, for example, which regularly hosts extremist content, every day around 6,000 images on memes of extremist material and content is uploaded on 4chan. We're seeing how that's then being shared on 8kun, on Telegram, on Gab, and the spread and the scale of that is just beyond belief. If you look at platforms like BitChute, for example, BitChute is a video alternative platform to YouTube. It's a registered UK company. It was founded by UK nationals. You look at the type of material that's just on this one platform, on BitChute, videos that have supported National Action, videos supporting Brenton Tarrant, videos supporting Combat 18, material that's celebrating incels and promoting the idea of incels, conspiracy theories from QAnon to the Great Replacement Theory to George Soros, anti-Semitic material, white supremacist material. In April this year, they tweeted that they had around, I think it was 20 million unique visitors to BitChute alone in that month. And has there been a single penalty that this platform has received? Not a single one. And I think as a country, as a society, we have to ask ourselves, is this acceptable? Because if people behave like this offline, it would be completely unacceptable. The fact that this is allowed to happen and there is no punishment, there is no prosecution at this moment in time, or that it's not being dealt with effectively. And again, this is where the Online Harms Bill is really, really critical. I think as a society, this is just completely unacceptable, and we have to grapple with this. And I've just given you just one example of BitChute. If we wanted to talk about Telegram, 4chan, 8kun, Gab, and then obviously the other mainstream platforms like Twitter and Facebook and all the other ones, I think you can see and get a sense of the scale of the problem that we are currently facing and what people in our country are currently facing and the harms that that's causing.
Thank you. That is extremely disturbing. Thank you very much for the introduction to that.
And is your sense that the lack of action then on BitChute is because there is no legal remedy there, or because the different authorities have not worked out how to respond?
I mean, I think that's a very good question. I think it's a number of different challenges. I think the first is where does this fall under CT legislation? In some cases, it probably does. In some cases, it doesn't. Some of it is not being captured by any legislation, and so looking at the legalities of this is important. There's often an issue around jurisdiction. Which police force should actually be looking at this? And I know I've spoken to people from different police agencies who don't understand whose jurisdiction this actually falls under. There's obviously an issue around the Online Harms Bill, which is going to be an incredibly important piece of legislation. And we can talk about that because I'm quite concerned about that. I've not really seen any strong policy proposals about how the government are going to deal with the issue of online extremism. And so there's a whole discussion around that. So I think there's different factors here. And again, I think it's going back to actually fundamentally overall what we are lacking is an effective national counter-extremism policy in this country and infrastructure. I mean, we have a very robust counter-terrorism infrastructure in this country. What we don't have is a counter-terrorism machinery. It's weak, it's disjointed, it's behind the curve, it's not operational, and that has to fundamentally change if we are now going to deal with this huge growing problem of extremism. And just to make this point really, that as a commission, we feel that the threat of extremism has increased over the last decade. The face of modern-day extremism has changed substantially. The ecosystem of hateful extremism has changed beyond recognition, despite the fact we do have a prevent strategy, despite the fact that we do have a counter-extremism strategy. So the current approach is not working. It's not responding to this challenge. And I think part of the reason also is because extremists have professionalised. You know, they have really gone to town, and the way they are operating now is in a way that I just don't think we've seen before. The way they've intellectualised their hate, the way they are now operating locally, nationally, transnationally. Many of these issues are not just facing us as a country, they're facing many other Western democracies. And I think now looking forward, when we talk about COVID, and one of our key findings from COVID was how extremists had exploited that. But if we see what's coming down the pipeline now as a country, we know there are going to be huge unemployment rates. We know that local authorities are going to have to make massive cuts because they are going to be experiencing financial black hole. We are seeing increasing rates of violence, soaring hate crime rates. That condition is, and that kind of climate is going to be very conducive for extremists and for extremism. And what we've seen throughout history is that that type of climate will be very conducive, and extremists will seek to exploit that. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, do we have the resource and the strategy to be able to deal with that? Because we know it's coming down the pipeline.
And have you seen an increase? Your assessment is that there's an increase in hateful extremism happening and an increase in hateful extremist activity. Have you seen any increase in the Home Office response at all?
So the challenge, I mean, we are waiting for the government to still officially respond to our report. The deadline was 3 months. That deadline has been and gone.
That was the October last year.
So yes, we published the report in October. Bearing in mind, of course, there was an election, there's the issue around Brexit. We've obviously had the issue of COVID. So I think it's, I've got to be fair, we've got to take that into consideration. I do recognise and I do believe that the government does care about this issue. My conversations with them is that they are trying to look at counter-extremism policy, including prevent, because there is a question of where does the counter-extremism strategy end and where does prevent begin? And I think there is a slight overlap and blurring of the boundaries around that work. And again, so I think the government are wanting to look at this properly, as well as respond to our recommendations, as well as discuss what is the future for the Commission itself. But I think getting that policy right is probably going to take a bit of time. But in the meantime, I think there's also got to be recognition of we also have to deal with this daily problem of extremism and at least work with the current infrastructure that we've got in place, but to hone in specifically on the issue of hateful extremism, because the current strategy, one of my criticisms of the current strategies, is far too broad. They've included things like forced marriage, honour-based violence, which those are all issues that I'm personally very conscious and care about, but they are not hateful extremism. And so it's I think in the meantime, while we wait for the government to make sure that policy is right, because that policy has to continue for the next 4, 5, 10 years, the way of dealing with this at the moment there's got to be something coming out of government in responding to the daily challenge of extremism.
Thank you. Diane Abbott.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm very interested in this concept of hateful extremism. After 30 years in Parliament, I'm well aware that decade by decade, people's idea about what constitutes extremism, both in the popular press and even amongst politicians, can vary quite drastically, and the groups singled out as extremists can vary quite drastically. Can you understand that some people might have a problem with the concept of hateful extremism, partly because it suggests two tiers of extremism, but also because it's an essentially subjective thing you're talking about. And I'm glad that you're having a legal review, because I think it's really important that any action we take about extremism takes place within the framework of law.
Yes, no, I agree, and I think this is why it was so important for us, for me in the first year and a half of the Commission's existence, was to go out and engage with people, to do the public consultation, to have a very serious and honest conversation with the public about what is absolutely traditionally viewed as a very subjective term. And that's why we did the public consultation, and that's where we saw that there is consensus around the behaviours we've identified as hateful extremism. There's no doubt that the E word is regularly misused. It's misused by politicians, it's misused by political parties, it's misused by all sorts of people for all sorts of different reasons. That's something I don't want to see. And I think from my perspective, there's a recognition of, yes, that type of behaviour happens, but that does not take away from the fact there is a problem of the type of hateful extremist activity that we are seeking to address, that we are seeing is harming our democracy, is harming the rights of minorities, it's creating a climate of censorship. I mean, these are some of the harms that we've found was as a result of extremism. And I think that's why, I have put forward in this report the idea of a rights-based response to extremism. It's in recognition of the fact that any counter-extremism measures we put forward must be in line with human rights norms and obligations that as a country we stand for, because we see that often in other countries where, particularly with authoritarian countries, where counter-extremism is used to silence legitimate debate and dissent. That's unacceptable. No British counter-extremism policy should have that. But also there has to be a recognition, and I don't think this has been acknowledged enough, which is how extremism itself threatens human rights and equality norms in this country. I would like to see, for example, more human rights organisations recognise that fact and say that, and to put forward their proposals and showing how can we protect our human rights principles and values which extremists are threatening every single day, whatever, because of your race, your religion, your sexuality, and so forth. And so I think it's really important that we take a rights-based approach to counter-extremism, and it's always about a balance. It's about the balance of one group of people or the individual against another. And that's where I think a human rights framework is very, very helpful in helping us to balance our responsibilities, ensuring we have a proportionate response to extremism. So yes, there's no doubt that the E word has been subjective over decades. I think it's wrong, completely wrong, that we've seen in history that green activists have wrongfully been labelled as extremists. We do not want to be going down that road. I'm very clear about that in my report, which is why what we're putting forward, I think, is a genuine way of challenging the issue of what we're calling hateful extremism, while ensuring we don't cross over and have a counterproductive effect and silence legitimate debate, protest, and free speech in this country.
You're resting a lot on your public consultation. Now, I think it's really important to consult with the public and listen to the public, but you also have to accept that what the public think at any point in time is framed by the broader debate, by the broader media. If you did a public consultation today, you would find people that would say, for instance, Black Lives Matter are hateful extremists. And people are wary of where you're going with this. I mean, 20 years ago, Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness could have been deemed hateful extremists, and yet, in the end, they formed an important part of the peace process. So, as I say, if you have actually looked at this issue over 30 years, you would tend to be cautious of where you're going with this two-tier extremism. Could you say a little bit more about how you balance freedom of expression, including the right to be offensive, with the action you want to take about what you are calling hateful extremism?
So, I mean, three things there. When we published our report, the reaction we got was actually very, very positive. We've not had the response that you're suggesting. Actually, we've had a very positive response. If you look at the response to the government's proposed counter-extremism bill in 2015, there was rightly a lot of furore to that bill. I myself at that time gave evidence speaking out against that bill. Groups like the Defend Free Speech Alliance spoke out against that bill, as did other religious faith communities and so forth. We've not had that response to this report. In fact, many of the people who are critical of the proposed counter-extremism bill have supported our proposal, have supported our thinking. So the Defend Free Speech Alliance, for example, have positively responded to our report, as have many faith communities and other people who have normally been quite hostile to this work. The issue of free speech, absolutely right, is a critical one. We made very clear in the report and outlining the distinction between free speech and the behaviours that we're looking at. Free speech is a qualified right. It can be legitimately restricted, as we know, in our country, but we have made very clear that the right to offend, the right to critical views, to dissent, all of those things we must protect in a democracy. There's absolutely no doubt about that in my mind. And so we've made that distinction clear in our report. And, we regularly get members of the public contacting us saying, look, we've seen this happening in our area. We think this is extremism. We've had to politely go back and say, thank you. This is really, this is quite offensive stuff, but it does not meet our threshold for what we are describing as hateful extremism. And just a word on free speech and free expression, because I think this is such an important issue in our country right now, in that, yes, as I said, it's a qualified right. Now, when you look at people and platforms like BitChute and particularly the far right, they have weaponised free speech in a way where they're acting as if there is no boundaries to free speech, that you cannot restrict free speech. And they are engaging in speech and language which is directly undermining the rights of other people, rights of other minority communities. And I think we have to have a better discussion about that and recognition of that, because that type of behaviour is actually, in my view, a direct assault on our democratic values. And so recognising the boundaries of free speech itself is really critical. And I think sometimes we don't have a good mainstream debate about this, that things like free speech are being weaponised by the far right for them to continue to perpetuate extremism in our country. So,
apologies for interrupting, but simply I'm just, all of the members all want to ask you questions, and responses are fascinating, but I'm just going to ask you actually to give slightly shorter answers so that we can get everybody in. Simon Fell.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to come back to social media platforms, but before I do, you published a report in July around hateful extremists using the pandemic as a platform to spread conspiracy theories. I'm interested to know what your assessment will be as to how that disinformation will spread going forwards and the effect of it.
So I think disinformation and conspiracy theories are fundamentally a key tactic for extremist groups. It's an everyday bread and butter tactic for extremist organisations and individuals. Social media have amplified conspiracy theories in a way that we've just never seen before. So if you look at, say, the Great Replacement theory, that was a theory around 20 years ago that was very much confined to the fringes of our society. That has now become a mainstream conspiracy theory, not only in our country but in many other parts of the world, and has directly contributed inspiring terrorists to carry out terrorist attacks. If you look at now QAnon, that's another conspiracy theory, how that's now infiltrating into the UK, and how more and more people are being exposed to conspiracy theories and disinformation. So it's a tactic used by extremists to spread extremist narratives and extremist propaganda. And my concern is, again, we don't have a very sophisticated strategy to deal with that. And again, I think this is where some of the things that we want to propose in terms of the Online Harms Bill is to classify and devise a classification system when it comes to extremist material, when it comes to conspiracy theories, because no one's going to have a problem in harmless conspiracy theories about whether Neil Armstrong walked on the moon, for example. But actually, this type of hateful extremist propaganda where, say, if people on social media platforms are saying we must deliberately infect Jews and Muslims, it was Jews who created the virus, engaging in that type of hateful extremist propaganda through the use of conspiracy theories we don't have a sophisticated approach to dealing with that, and we have to get better at addressing that.
Thank you. Can I just pick you up on the social media platforms? Because quite rightly you're talking about online harms and the role of the government in creating a framework there, but I'm interested in your assessment of how well the platforms themselves are responding to this content in terms of taking down offensive material and hateful content, and also the divide, if there is one, between what might be seen as the traditional social media companies and their platforms and some of these new platforms like BitChute and Gab and others.
So, I mean, I and my commission have had many conversations with social media companies, and I think when it comes to illegal terrorist content, it's much more simpler. It's much more easy and much more, it's clarified in law what that looks like, and we know the Counter-Terrorism Internet Referral Unit are regularly taking down that material. In the Online Harms Bill, extremism has been defined as being lawful but harmful. Like I said earlier, I don't see any policy proposals in dealing with that. And again, it goes back to what does the government mean by extremism? Because that's a question that social media companies put to me. They'll say, well, yes, we want to play our part, but the government haven't given us a definition or haven't provided us with clarity on what do you mean by extremism. And so again, they put that back to the government and say, it's your problem, you're not telling us what that looks like and what we should be actually, what kind of material it is that we should be taking down. So I think we've got to overcome that. We shouldn't give any room for social media companies to evade their responsibility of responding to this type of material. I mean, that's why we are doing the legal review, because I said earlier, I think some of this material, which is currently classed as lawful, should be made illegal. But also, secondly, I think for us as a way forward in terms of dealing with online extremism, my policy proposal to the government is that depending on who that regulator is at the moment, it's suggested that Ofcom would be dealing with this material. I would say, actually, I believe the Commission should be dealing and assessing online extremism. We want to put together a very transparent and rigorous classification system. So if you think of something like the classification system for drugs, I think that's something that needs to do with extremist material, because using just a single definition on its own is not going to be helpful, because there's such a diversity of extremist material out there. So I believe that the Commission should be the body that deals with assessing extremist content online, and that's my proposal to the government. And I think also that the government then should there should be a duty on social media companies, a public duty to have due regard to our recommendations. That way we're making it much more difficult for social media companies to evade their responsibility, and we're providing the clarity that they rightly seek.
Thank you. And last question, and it may be a slightly unfair one. Just in terms of the platforms themselves, is your assessment that they are willing to engage if government takes that step forward, or are some of them which badge themselves as freedom of speech platforms, or whatever the terminology may be, are they less willing to take that step?
So I think the mainstream platforms are willing to engage. The alternative platforms that you're referring to, I mean, they boast about the fact that they are less regulated, that they are free from any type of censorship. I think we are going to struggle with those platforms. So I think recognising that difference is really important.
Thank you.
Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Sara, for your evidence today. I want to follow up on what you've already said about pinning down a definition, a working definition of extremism, because, as you've said, the E word is regularly misused. Is it misused by public authorities? Our government, the police service, local authorities clear on what extremism is? So
this is, again, where the challenge lies, and I think this is why the counter-extremism strategy, which is based on the government's definition of extremism from 2015, just does not work. As I said earlier, it is clearly a subjective term. It always has been. But I think that, like I said, it doesn't dissuade and doesn't take away from the fact that there's a genuine extremist problem that exists in our country. And when we gathered all the evidence we found that many people have described those experiences and how they're being targeted by extremist organisations, from journalists to Jews, Muslims, to a whole range of different groups of people. And so I think it's trying to now bridge the gap and putting forward a clear proposal, a clear policy, and thinking around about this, where we do not want this. People will continue to use the E word in whatever shape or form they want to use. However, in an institutionalised way, this is where the counter-extremism policy really, really matters, because to deal with this in a much more operational sense, that's where we need to go, and we just don't have that at the moment.
You mentioned in passing green activism. What are your views on Extinction Rebellion? Are they, or their recent activity, extremist in your view?
So, as you probably recall, last year, I think it was the Southeast or the Southwest Counter-Terrorism police units, I think it came out where they'd stated Extinction Rebellion to be an extremist group. I made very clear at that point that I thought that was wrong. I do not consider Extinction Rebellion to be an extremist group. The issue of climate change is an incredibly important one, and so I think it's really important to make the distinction between individuals in an organisation who may be engaging in criminality, and we make sure that the law deals with them in the right way. But to brandish the entire organisation, and many people, many of our colleagues and friends who support Extinction Rebellion and the issue of climate change, brandishing the entire organisation as an extremist organisation, I think is blatantly wrong. There have been concerns about some senior leaders promoting anti-Semitic views. Again, I think we need to challenge that, raise that, highlight that issue. But the work of Extinction Rebellion clearly does not meet my threshold for hateful extremism.
And doesn't that really pinpoint the danger here, that unless we have a very clear definition that everybody can agree on, you're going to get some public authorities branding organisations as extremist? And doesn't that therefore really highlight the need for a legal definition, the need for absolute clarity on what forms extremism versus free speech?
And I don't think that's difficult. I think it's possible to have that. Like I said, what we found was 95% of the public also believe and agree that it is possible to get consensus on a definition. And I think this is where actually the very positive response to our work and our report has shown that there is a way forward, that we can deliver a strategy, we can deliver consensus, we can deliver a definition of extremism, which is specifically addressing the extremism you and I and everybody else in the country are actually concerned about, as opposed to curtailing legitimate dissent and all sorts of other lawful behaviour in our country.
Thank you. Diana Johnson.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Sara, for everything you're doing. I wanted to just pick up on what you've been saying about the government's counter-extremism strategy this morning, and what you said in the report that you published last year, where you talked about it being unfocused, unnecessarily broad, and at times confusing, and the need for a complete overhaul. And you've said already that you haven't received a response yet, and obviously we've had COVID, and you're very conscious of the broadness of this whole issue and the blurring, as you've talked about. But you also mentioned that this is something that needs to be tackled on a daily basis, and I just wondered if you could say a bit more about what could the government do now to deal with some of the issues that you've highlighted, the problems with the current strategy, to actually provide some way forward now before they perhaps produce a completely new strategy?
So as part of the government's counter-extremism strategy, there is funding that goes to civil society groups as part of their Building a Stronger Britain Together programme. There are community coordinators, I can't quite remember the figure, it's around 40 that are embedded in local authorities, whose job it is to work with local councils, local communities, civil society groups to tackle local-based extremism. What I would say, what my advice to the government would be, we've put forward the type of activity and behaviours, the beliefs and narratives that underpins hateful extremism. I believe that current structure we have should be focusing on that. So any type of work that isn't dealing with the type of hateful extremism I've highlighted, that should be abandoned. So that, for example, work around forced marriages or honour-based violence, my advice to the government would be there should be no funding from BSBC projects, no community coordinators should be doing work on that. What they need to be focusing on is tackling what I've identified as the beliefs, behaviours and harms of hateful extremism, so challenging the narratives of far-right groups. So if the far-right organisations are spreading conspiracy theories, or if they're spreading anti-Semitic or anti-Muslim narratives, to challenge those beliefs, to challenge the behaviours and to do more to support victims. I mean, the issue of around harm was really important. What we found was that victims of extremism, they're not even acknowledged, to be totally honest with you. Their experiences, that there's no support for them. How can we better to support them? So I think looking at work around those three pillars is where I would say the government should be focusing its efforts and in terms of funding for civil society groups and also community coordinators as well.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And you also stated that the government's efforts have suffered from a lack of consistent, strong internal leadership on the issue, and recommended that the Home Secretary take the lead by chairing a new task force. So do you think that in the conversations that you're having, is that something that we might see happen? So,
I mean, one thing that's very apparent to me when it comes to tackling extremism as a general comment is that leadership is required, to be able to speak out against extremism, extremist groups and individuals, particularly within our own political parties or within our own faith communities. That's not an easy thing to do. And so, yes, leadership is required. And of course, we have to have leadership from the government. We also need leadership from social media companies, from local authorities, from faith leaders. So leadership is something that we need to see from everybody if we genuinely want to address this problem. I still strongly believe that the Home Secretary should lead a task force on extremism. And again, I mean, that's a formal recommendation. I'm waiting for that response, but I hope that that's something the government will do. Can I just also, on the first question you asked me about support and about what more the government can do, I would just make the point about the experiences of counter-extremists, because people who actually do this work, one thing that came out of our report was, and this is a shocking statistic which we don't acknowledge enough, is that 78% of people who do this work experience abuse, intimidation, threats. People have told me they've experienced rape threats, death threats. People who've said that a third of them have had to, they've been shunned by their family, by their local community. This is really shocking, and I don't think we recognise or appreciate the work of counter-extremists in this country who are experiencing severe levels of distress and abuse, who are being labelled, for example, Islamophobic because they are challenging Islamist extremism, and how often public figures end up supporting those very organisations as opposed to the counter-extremists who are putting literally a lot of their time and effort into protecting our democracy and our democratic values. And so that is something else I would say to the government in terms of that has to be looked at pretty quickly, because a lot of people I know no longer want to do this work because the cost to them, to their lives, is just far too high.
So the task force isn't up and running that you recommended?
So, no.
So I asked the Home Secretary about that on the 15th of June, and she told me in terms of the task force, work is taking place now on that and has been for some time within the department. Are you aware of what that work is?
I'm not aware of any work that on the task force. There's no work happening, as far as I understand and am aware, on the task force.
When did you last meet the Home Secretary?
Yesterday.
Did you raise the task force?
Yes, so I said, put it to her, this is something that I believe that she needs to lead. And so, again, it'll be very interesting to see if this is something that they will respond to.
Excellent. Laura Farris.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much for your evidence. It's been a shock to me to learn that BitShoot has its registered office in Newbury in my constituency, and I think I've seen directly some of the things you've been talking about with the difficulties that I've had in knowing how to report it, either to Ofcom or to the Thames Valley Police. Can I just ask you what you think the online harm bill should seek to achieve in terms of creating a direct reporting mechanism or a sort of body that is accountable and can deal with these extreme social media sites that set up wherever?
So again, I think this is where the government needs to be clear about specifically dealing with online extremism, because if you're talking about illegal behaviour, it's more clear as to what we need to be doing. When it comes to this type of activity, which is currently defined as being lawful but harmful, this is where, again, I'm not seeing strong policy proposals. I think the first thing we need to do is to be very clear on the assessment of that material, because there are always going to be disputes about whether this material is indeed meeting the threshold for the type of the level of hateful extremism I'm concerned about. And so that's why having a clear system of assessing this material is important. That's why we're saying we want to devise this classification system with clear boundaries, so everyone is clear as to what this type of material is and what should be done about it. And so that's something we're working on at the moment. What should be the response to that type of material, to the different types of material? In some cases, it may be referring it to the police. In other cases, it may be companies taking it down. So in some cases, it may be, I feel, that there should be civil and criminal sanctions, legal sanctions. I feel at the moment that nothing should be off the table, that we need to have serious conversations about should it be acceptable for sites like 4chan or BitChute to even exist. I think those conversations need to have happened, and we've not. I don't think we're having them properly. So nothing should be off the table.
Can I ask you another question about Article 10 rights and freedom of speech?
Yes.
Because when I looked at the BitChute site, it was quite obvious they were playing to a sense of honest conversation. They were appealing to a sense of grievance, and I thought that some of their content was obviously unlawful or inciting unlawful behaviour, and other was far more difficult to classify. Just to give you one example, some of the kind of incel stuff about the views of women, and some of the videos of them in and of themselves would not meet, I don't think, any threshold. I think you mentioned before a classification system, a bit like with drugs. Could you talk about that and where criminal thresholds might apply?
What we've identified in our report also is that extremist organisations, they engage in a whole range of lawful and illegal behaviour. There's a lot of things that you'll be seeing on BitChute which are perfectly acceptable in terms of discussion. It might be offensive, it might be rude, but they are perfectly legitimate discussions to be having in our country. So again, and then you've got at the same time very disturbing, illegal and incredibly dangerous types of speech in terms of incitement and so forth. This is where, again, I think why a classification system is really needed, because you're going to then use a criteria which you would use to assess different types of material. We don't have that at the moment. And I think there's been a flaw in counter-extremism policy over the years, where there's an expectation that we have one definition of extremism and somehow we'll use that as a criteria to be able to judge everything. That's just, that's just not going to work practically, because extremism is a spectrum of different types of activity and material. So that's why we feel having that classification approach is really important. And I laugh when I hear the founders of BitChute use the language of human rights and free speech to defend their attacks on minorities and to defend white supremacist, neo-Nazi, neo-fascist material. And we shouldn't fall for that argument either.
Could I just ask you one very brief question at the end? I think one of the sort of senses I had from BitChute is that there are sort of gateway clips that you might view which are less extreme, that would lead you to the more extreme. And I was wondering what your view was on the kind of recruitment might not be quite the right word, but the sort of engagement issues about social media platforms, because we've seen these new very young far-right groups, British Hand, and the way that they've been sort of reported interacting with one another over the small boat crossings. Could you sort of speak, I don't know whether you have a view on the recruitment or the engagement or the drawing in of young people or unexpected people to these?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, there's always been a concern around young people being radicalised and the gateway. And I think what's interesting is how the ecosystem of far-right extremism in this country is rapidly changing. So we know there are broadly three areas where you've got your kind of radical right populist groups, you have neo-fascist groups, you have neo-Nazi groups. But I think even that now is changing quite rapidly, where you have, for example, conspiracy theories, so anti-vax conspiracy theories, QAnon, those types of discussions, and how that is drawing in the far-right young people and others. I was reading something over the weekend where somebody was saying that their mother and grandmother had come across QAnon conspiracy theories during lockdown, and how that was then making them turn into to being exposed to more far-right extremist material. So often what you find is that this material does act as a gateway. It acts as a door to much more for extremist material, and then where does it end? And so it is really, really concerning, and in its social media that has allowed that to happen.
Thank you.
Thank you. Stuart MacDonald.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Ms Can, for your evidence. Just to pick up on Laura Farris's last question there have been increasing reports of children and young people being or engaging with and being recruited into far-right groups. What is the scale of that, as far as you're aware, and how do we go about tackling that and stopping it happening?
So I think it's difficult to put a figure on it. Obviously, channel. People are often referred to channel from all sorts of ages. We're now seeing, I think, around half of referrals to channel are for far-right extremism. The issue of extremism in young people has always been a long-term concern. I don't think this is anything new. I mean, this is why the prevent duty was brought in, because the fact that schools have an obligation to ensure that any concerns around people being drawn into extremism should be reported, should be dealt with, that we can provide a support system for young people needs to be dealt with. And I think that the work of the prevent duty is really critical in that regard, because if we didn't have that, I'm not sure we would have anything else. And when I've gone around the country and I've spoken to hundreds of teachers, head teachers, both across England and Wales, this issue of young people espousing extremist views and also racist views has been quite alarming. I mean, I repeatedly hear that, and again, a lot of this information is anecdotal, but there is clearly a problem felt amongst many teachers that more and more young people are promoting and holding racist, extremist, anti-women views, and I'm not sure whether the current system in place in terms of whether the national curriculum is dealing with that effectively. I'd like that to be dealt with much more mainstreamed in the national curriculum, but it's clearly a growing problem.
Sure. Isn't the problem, though, of relying on the prevent duty that if you get to that stage, we're already leaving it too late, and that more has to be done to try and get young folk and children into a position whereby they're aware that they are being groomed or recruited by these far-right organisations in the first place? If we're having to refer them down into the sort of prevent strategy, then surely things have gone too far already.
So I think this is why I'm saying I think having a national curriculum that responds to this very 21st century problem, it is important that we are building resilience amongst young people. We talk to them about extremism. We talk to them about why extremist ideological beliefs, what they are and how dangerous they are and why they are wrong, challenging conspiracy theories. So you're doing that kind of preventative building resilience work within schools. The prevent duty almost acts as a net that captures young people who are spouting these views and who then clearly need that one-to-one support and safeguard. So I think having a stronger focus within the national curriculum where we are building resilience, because young people are being exposed to this material every single day. Everyone has their smartphones and it's easily accessible. And I don't feel that we're helping to build resilience amongst young people and making them informed about how a lot of these conspiracy theories are blatantly untrue.
Tim Lawson.
I'm interested in your ideas about the drug classification, but I'd like to hear your thoughts about whether we need to change the law. And if you look at what laws we have already, the Public Order Act from 1986 actually criminalised conduct intended or likely to, so it didn't actually have to do it. And there's been very few prosecutions under that. I think the highest amount was in 2018-19 of 13, so tiny. You said just now that this is a uniquely 21st century problem. Well, it isn't really, is it? Because if we go back to the 1930s, there was a Public Order Act in 1936, which, amongst other things, banned the wearing of political uniforms in order to counter the black shirts. The black shirts were not banned, and Mosley was not imprisoned until wartime under internment laws rather than existing laws. And arguably one could say that some of these right-wing lunatics marching through Dover is the equivalent of Cable Street to try and incite violence there. So we have these laws, but for some reason they haven't actually been applied. So will changing laws change anything?
You're absolutely right. This is not a unique problem. I clarify what I mean. I mean in the sense of the modern day, this modern face of extremism in terms of social media is a new and unique problem. You're absolutely right. I mean, extremism has existed throughout time. There are many historical records of extremism, and it will continue to exist because it is a human social ill. So we will always have peaks and troughs of extremism in our society. In terms of the law, I mean, we are conducting this legal review. As I said, I've appointed Sir Mark Rowley to look at this, to understand whether there are gaps in the law or whether the application of the current legislation is not adequate, it's not dealing with this growing problem. You're right to highlight about the fact that I think last year there were around 11 cases for incitement offences. Now you look at that and you look at the regular incitement that I'm seeing on a day-to-day basis and what extremists are doing, and there seems to be a bit of a mismatch there. So again, this is why doing the legal review is absolutely critical, and we're happy to come back and to report our findings at that time.
Because it just strikes me that if laws are there and for some reason not working, the first point of call should be why are they not working? Do they need to be adapted, or are they just not being applied? And in which case, why are the police not applying, or the courts not applying them, or whatever? But how do you disentangle legitimate debate about people with concerns that may be viewed by many as extreme, and individuals, or more commonly groups, particularly these extreme right-wing groups now, hijacking that concern in order to promote an innate hatred, discrimination that they have. It just happens to be it's the migrant boats, it's the cause they're going to leap upon in order to be anti-migrant, racist, or whatever it might be. How do we disentangle the two so that people can be prejudiced and cause offence, but not want to cause harm to people that they have dodgy opinions about, aside from those who do want to cause harm physically or mentally or in whatever form, and that's really what they're about.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, so the example of Dover and Britain First is a really good example to have this discussion around. I mean, the issue of immigration and the ability to have a debate about immigration is something we have to protect. And when I think often there are people who will try and close down that debate altogether, brandishing anybody as being racist, and that's completely unhelpful. The distinction, therefore, is when you're seeing, and this is what we see time and time again, when far-right groups are exploiting that issue to deliberately engage in campaigns of hatred, dehumanising migrants, engaging in incitement, engaging in really frightening tactics against migrants and asylum seekers and refugees, and that's the difference. And I think that this is why precisely the hateful extremism definition is helpful, because people can have all sorts of views about immigration. When you're coming into the space now where now you're deliberately inciting hatred with intent against people, particularly people who have a protected characteristic, when you're justifying violence against them, that is not the same as people having legitimate concerns about immigration. And there have been legitimate concerns raised in Dover by local people, and we should allow that to happen. But that's very different to the activity of groups like Britain First, as we've been seeing.
And finally, we've talked exclusively about extreme right-wing groups. Can you apply the same concerns to left-wing alternative groups? For example, quoting the 1936 Public Offences Act Against Political Uniforms, we saw during Black Lives Matter demonstrations uniformed demonstrators, which could have constituted certainly an investigation, if not a prosecution, under the Public Offences Act.
Yes.
And then we have, as part of a modern hip culture, black comedians talking about killing whiteys, I think was the term that was used on television recently. There's no reason that should be immune in any way from investigation under these sorts of inciting hatred considerations?
So I've made very clear when I took on this role that we would be looking at all forms of extremism. I commissioned some academics to look at the issue of far-left extremism in this country. There's no doubt that we lack academic research about far-left extremism in this country. There's probably a whole load of reasons why that isn't, and I'm not going to go into that now. But I think that we have seen, and I'm very aware of, that there is, for example, hateful extremism emanating from the far left against Jews, the kind of incitement against Jewish MPs, against Jewish organisations, for example. It's very clear and very obvious, and I don't think we have a very good discussion about that, and some of the examples you've given. And so, to be very clear, extremism is not confined to one particular ideology. It cuts across all different types of groups of people, faith communities. We looked at issues around Sikh extremism. There's aspects of Hindu extremism we're concerned about. We looked at the issue around animal rights extremism, far left extremism, and I think the only way that you can deal with the issue of extremism is to take a consistent approach and be prepared to call it all out wherever it comes from.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll need to move to our next panel in a second. Just one final question from me. Given we don't yet have a timetable for the online harms bill, we haven't yet got the task force in place, and we haven't yet got the provisions in place and the measures that you have been recommending. If we don't have any further action, say over the next 12 months in any of these fields, what do you see as being the risks?
So I think as I said earlier, in terms of the COVID landscape, there was already an issue of growing extremism anyway. The issue of how now the impact the COVID's going to have on our country. We are going to see a growing climate of extremism in our country, and we are ill-equipped currently to deal with that. So this is a matter of urgency, and if the government doesn't have a strategy in place pretty soon, I'm afraid it will impact our country in many different ways, from undermining community cohesion. Some of the harms that we've highlighted in our reports, which include we will see social division, we will see crime, public disorder, violence and harassment. We will see people trying to restrict our citizens' rights, and there will be an undermining of democracy overall. So there is a genuine concern and impact on our country to the rights of citizens, and so it's really important the government recognises this and deals with it appropriately.
Thank you very much, Sara Khan. Thank you very much for your evidence. We're going to very briefly pause the committee while we just change panels.
Suspended. The proceeding is currently 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 suspended.
We continue our Home Affairs Evidence Session, Evidence Committee Evidence Session, and welcome Assistant Commissioner Neil Basu, the National Lead for Counter-Terrorism. Welcome. I'm very conscious that we are sitting and hearing from you at the time when the public inquiry is underway into the attack at Manchester Arena. And obviously everyone will have heard the very many moving stories and tributes to the victims of the that awful and vile attack. And we've heard the very much the bravery of the families of the victims, which we pay tribute to as well, in giving such moving testimony to their loved ones who they've lost, and our thoughts are with them. And we also thank you for the work that all of your officers and teams have done in supporting the victims of the Manchester attack and pursuing the all of those involved as well. Thank you. Can I welcome you to give you, can I ask you, Assistant Commissioner, to just give us your reflections on the terror threat that you face at the moment and that you're anticipating?
Thank you. I mean, if you would just give me 1 minute to say that, you know, we are only just in the third week of that Manchester public inquiry. Myself and a number of my senior team will be giving evidence in that inquiry. It has been incredibly moving day by day to hear the accounts that family members have made, and our hearts and our condolences and sympathy for all of my organisation, and I'm sure my sister organisation, MI5, go out to the families. We only get up every day to stop terrorist attacks. I was a very experienced murder investigator once, and I never wanted to be that in counter-terrorism. We want to stop these attacks, and everywhere I go I'm constantly thanked, and my organisation is thanked for what we do. I'm very aware that since March 2017 there have been 12 attacks, and it's very difficult to accept that thanks when those attacks always feel to me like a personal failure. I said 2 years ago when I appeared in front of you that my job in 2017 was to work with MI5 and stop terrorist attacks, and there were 5 that year on my watch. And I thought about that every single day, and I can tell you 2 years later that I still think about those attacks every single day, and the 7 that have succeeded following that. And the only reason I took this job, I told you 2 years ago, was to try and make the UK counter-terrorism machine as effective as it possibly could be. And one of the things we do whenever there is an attack is sometimes whilst we're in the middle of investigating, we are already starting the debrief process and the learning process. It's something the Chief Coroner picked up on in Westminster and London Bridge inquests, and recognised that we are constantly trying to tweak the machine to make it as effective as it can be, to stop any victim being killed, any family being crucified and grieving, and to help survivors. We desperately want to make our machine the best it can be. We talked in 2018 about the work we did in 2017, commissioned by the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police and the DG of MI5 in the Operation Improvement Review, and we have been working at pace for 3 years on the 103 recommendations that came from that, and of course every subsequent attack post-2017 has been subject to the same debrief, and we are implementing hundreds of recommendations. Now, some of that, and this is very frustrating for families involved in inquests, some of the changes to the machine that we've made are not going to be able to be talked about in an open public forum. Myself, the new DG of MI5, Cressida and Andrew Parker, spent nearly 10 hours in front of the Intelligence and Security Committee talking about some of those changes we wanted to make post-2017. But I wanted to reassure your committee that is essentially the reason I'm sitting here today, is to continue that work.
Thank you.
I'll turn to the threat and tempo as it currently stands. So I also refreshed my memory on what I had said to you in 2018. And at that time we talked about having breached 700 investigations jointly with MI5, and now we're well over 800. So we predicted in 2017 that the threat would rise by 30%, and it did. And it's still there. It's sustained at that very high level. We would describe it as diverse, complex and unpredictable, and it's largely a result of 2 big factors. The first is the post-Snowden encryption effect, and where encryption has made it very difficult to see terrorists communicating, and the second is the prevalence of the change in the type of terrorist and the type of methodology and the type of vector of attack. So since 2010 there have been 16 terrorist attacks, and 15 of them have been committed by what we have all got used to calling lone actors. Now the reality of lone actors is that's a poor definition, and we're trying to give a better definition, because they're rarely actually alone. They've quite often talked about their plans with somebody else who may not realise that that's what the person is doing, and they've quite often operated with somebody else. But what they have not been is directed or supported or financed or enabled by a group. And that, of course, was a change in tactic from the Islamic State when they started to try and inspire people to commit attacks. And what's changed, certainly over the last 5 years, is effectively the groups that were Al-Qaeda and Daesh in the Islamist terrorism space have become much, much weaker because of the military campaigns. So their ability to direct and inspire overseas has become very limited, but their ability to inspire rather than direct through media and propaganda has not diminished, and in fact is showing some signs of resurgence, and that is something we are very alive to. Now, alongside that, the rise that Sara's just been talking about in right-wing terrorism extremism has been pretty dramatic. So in 2016 I would have talked about 6% of my casework being right-wing terrorism and somewhere in the region of 75 to 80% being Islamist. It's still 75 to 80% Islamist, but actually it's now 10% right-wing terrorism. One of the learnings from 2017 was that we needed MI5 to get involved in this. The UK intelligence community, we had to be ideologically agnostic to the threat, and they needed to look much more closely at right-wing terrorism. I'm incredibly proud that our organisation has managed to do that, and MI5 took over the intelligence primacy responsibility on the 6th of April. Almost immediately we're beginning to discover more, thanks to the tools and techniques that we've been able to use. Now, does that mean there's more volume? I don't know, and I'm not saying that, but we have been able to see more of what is there. But a near doubling of that threat since 2016 does worry me, and the ability of that, the messaging and the way that people are incited, groomed and effectively brought to the fore is largely what Sara's just been talking about. I came to listen, I was joking with Sara outside saying, I'll be incredibly surprised if I disagree with a single word you said. I'm not surprised, I don't disagree with it. If you wanted to, I would adopt her evidence tomorrow. And that is my biggest concern at the moment, is where extremism affects malleable, vulnerable people of all kinds, age groups, societal backgrounds. There is no one route to a terrorist path. But the amplification of extremism and its ability to incite a vulnerable section of the population towards terrorism, which is where myself and MI5 set in, is probably my greatest single fear.
So you agree that there has been a rise in hateful extremism, and you are seeing the consequences in terms of the terrorist threat?
Yeah, I mean, I don't just think that. That's what the Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre would say. It's what the Home Office, Office of Security and Counter-Terrorism would say. It's what RICU, their internal unit, would say. And it's what my experts would say. So what's interesting is, COVID-19 has amplified that problem. But what we haven't seen, and my experts tell me we have not seen an increase in tact-related material. What we've seen is an increase in hateful extremism-related material, if I was to use Sara's committee's definition. So one of the things that we didn't talk about with Sara was the ability of terrorists, when they were much earlier in their journey, to be talking in extremist ways, which we were incapable of dealing with as a law enforcement community. So ALM, one of the most famous groups behind Islamist extremism, which have motivated, inspired many terrorist attacks worldwide, started as an organisation that we could not get a prosecution on because of the way they were speaking, and were very clever about staying the right side of the law as it stood then, and that is a significant issue for society.
Thank you. Diana Davison.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Assistant Commissioner, for being with us today. And could I just get on record my thanks to you and your whole team for the incredible work you're doing to try and keep the country safe, but also to the wider policing family for the additional pressures that I know they're under and all the hard work during the lockdown. So my sincerest thanks there. It's quite a broad question to begin with, but just overall, what impact has kind of COVID and the subsequent lockdown had on your work in counter-terror policing?
So I'd probably talk about two things. One is the impact on the threat that we're currently facing, and the other is the impact on us as an operational organisation alongside the UK intelligence community. So let's talk about the threat. So we don't see that COVID-19 has increased the terrorist threat. I've just said what it has done is definitely increased the amplification of hateful extremism, and Sara's given good evidence on that. I won't repeat what she said. The outcome of all of that we have yet to see. So I don't know how that's going to influence the next generation. What I am seeing, particularly in the right-wing terrorism space, and this is anecdotal, so it's not academic, but is an increase in lots of young people being attracted to this. So we are seeing people as young as 13 starting to talk about committing terrorist acts. We are seeing people mixed in their ideology. So actually the largest growth in prevent referrals, 38% of them, is in people whose ideology we can't determine. We don't know whether it's Islamist or right-wing or left-wing extremism or incel, or they're just interested in violence. Now, when you've been locked down and with social media having such an influence on every single one of us in our daily lives, and you're able to sit there and just take all of that in on a permanent basis with no other form of distraction or protective factor around you, and I'm thinking schooling, employment, other friends, family members who are not influenced or potentially extremist themselves, that is a concern. So that is definitely an effect of COVID-19 we're worried about. One of the other effects, which affects protect and prepare, is the change in crowded spaces, particularly when we go back to March and April, when we saw supermarkets and hospitals become the new crowded spaces of the future. And now we're looking at a model which actually we don't talk about crowded spaces. I mean, there's no doubt terrorists will always go for iconic venues, but they will go for the crowd. Now, across this country, there are, I think, well over 600,000 publicly accessible spaces at which a crowd could be targeted. And of course, the Streatham High Road attack tells you it could just be a local high street. So that kind of concerns us. There is no way that we are going to be able to police that or secure that kind of volume of sites. So we've been talking with the government about the protect duty that they're talking about public consultation on, and actually owners and operators of places where the public has access will need to step up in the same way that they do for health and safety or for licensing. There will need to be a security measure, I think. It needs to be low cost, preferably nil cost. We provide training free, it's online. We will be looking to create a much better website and information sharing platform. I'm acutely aware of small business, the economic consequences of COVID. They don't need extra red tape, regulation and cost, but what they can do is massively amplify their effect with some free online training simply to their staff to look out for their customers. That is something that COVID-19 has brought very clearly to the fore. In terms of my organisation, you'll be pleased to know it was incredibly resilient. We brought in working practices that meant that we were perfectly capable of dealing with a concurrent terrorist attack, and I think we proved that in the Reading case, but we were exercising and testing that actually before Reading occurred to make sure that we were match fit. What we did see was a suppression in all crime, and that includes terrorism, during COVID, during the lockdown. Now that suppression and the lack of travel meant that large bits of my business effectively were not employed in CT duties, so aviation policing. Some of the main borders were closed. Some of the major ports had reduced demand. We weren't protecting VIPs because they weren't moving around and travelling. And particularly on the investigation side, there was clearly a suppression in terrorist attack planning. So we used that spare capacity to help in the organised crime and major crime space, and also in the what were called in London the PEMA patrols around mass gatherings. So we used counter-terrorism capability to help my core policing colleagues as well. Now clearly, as we came out of lockdown and the demand started to go up, that is not going to be sustainable. But actually it was, in terms of our ability to respond to protect the public, I think we were in a very good place.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Laura Farris.
Thank you very much. Can I just pick up on what you were talking about in relation to the loan attacks? And one of the features of, I think, Reading, Fishmongers Hall, and I believe Streatham, is that all of the assailants were recently released from prison. I was wondering if you could perhaps talk about where you think responsibility falls on the prison estate and difficulties that you may have had in engagement with that. And also about the new sentencing white paper that Robert Buckland sort of announced in the House last week, which has specific powers, I think, for probation officers to recommend continuing remand for people whose behaviour has exhibited sort of worrying signs in prison. Anything that you have to say about that?
So I support all of that. I think Robert Buckland has tried to improve our ability to deal with terrorist risk offenders in the community. I use terrorist risk offenders as a title because that's what Jonathan Hall, the independent reviewer of terrorist legislation, talked about in his very well considered, very detailed examination of the MAPA system. So I would, this is a joint responsibility between policing MI5 and the Prison and Probation Service. You know, I am not going to talk about one of those services not being match fit better than the rest, but what those 4 attacks, and I talked about our learning and debriefing process, there are actually 8 debriefing, learning, inquiry processes going on as a result just of fishmongers, let alone the other 3 attacks. They've all led to obvious improvements that we can make in our system, both in terms of our consistency in the way we deal with terrorists within the secure state and when they are released, and some gaps in the law that needed to be filled, and I think Robert Buckland has explained those. And in terms of the Counter-Terrorism and Security Bill, which also has some measures in there, including the end of early release and extended sentencing, and the Sentencing Council that we did the year before to improve sentencing, all of that is incredibly important as well. And I'd refer the committee to Tim Jake's evidence, I believe it was in late June, in front of the Parliamentary Bill Committee, which would have talked about our support for some of those measures. So, there is no doubt about it, there is a massive difficulty in our ability to see somebody escalating, being able to understand what people's thought processes are and whether they still represent a violent extremist terrorist threat to communities is incredibly difficult. One of the frameworks we use is a 22-point reference framework that can only be applied by experienced clinical psychologists, because otherwise we would end up with a massive number of false positives. And this is a problem that my organisation and MI5 deal with on a minute-by-minute daily basis, is trying to reduce what is in someone's mind and what trajectory they're on. It is incredibly complicated.
It's been interesting to hear you talk about the new provisions that are coming through. I mean, are you satisfied that blend of sort of enhanced sentencing, the potential to continue detention or imprisonment, and generally the new counter-terrorism bill, do you think that provides you with the suite of powers that you need to tackle this threat, or are there still gaps that you think the government hasn't properly addressed?
There are very few gaps in terrorist legislation in this country. I mean, this country has had very robust terrorist legislation because of its history, certainly with Northern Ireland and dissident Republican terrorism and the way it's had to develop its terrorist legislation. So we're often asked, do we need more powers? And we are very circumspect about what we actually say. There's no point having powers, and actually an earlier question on public order powers and whether they were sufficient or whether they've been sufficiently used, means if we ask for lots of legislation that we never use, it comes into disrepute. So we don't want to be in that space. I think this suite of measures is important. Some of them are not, were not asked for by necessarily policing law enforcement, but they are manifesto commitments. I've looked at all of them in detail. I don't see that any of them are things that we wouldn't want to bring in, given the way the threat is changing, as I've described. There are other things that we need. I mean, if I really wanted to put weight behind legislation that we need in this country, it would be the Protect Duty I've mentioned. It would be the Online Harms Bill, which I think, and I won't repeat what Sara said, but will be incredibly important in terms of one of the greatest threats, I think, to this country, which is the fomentation of hatred online. And the espionage bill that we're working on as well, because of our name as counter-terrorism policing, people forget we're the prime law enforcement body that deals with hostile state activity as well, and that is on the rise.
Thank you.
So those 3 things, and there are some. I could talk about Section 49, which is the ability of us to demand a password to get into encrypted devices, our ability to get data from cloud servers, which is complicated by the Misuse of Computer Act when they're outside of UK jurisdiction, and we can't use our regular arrest, search and warrant powers to get access to that data. That's a lacuna in the law. And probably there's one other that I've been thinking about, which unfortunately I've had a senior moment on. But generally speaking, what I would say is we have a government and preceding governments that have actually been very positive about wanting to close off lacunas in the law. So we have good support, we have good involvement. We're asked to go and demonstrate our operational need on a regular basis with OSCT, with whom we have a good relationship. So I'm not here to complain about a lack of legal cover.
Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Assistant Commissioner, for the evidence that you're giving today, and also for the work that you and your officers do to keep us safe. On that, the Reading attacker had been assessed by both Prevent and MI5 and had been deemed to pose no danger of staging an attack. Are there any lessons that can be learned from this about the assessment process to avoid any future loss of life?
Yes, but it will never, ever be foolproof. So the point I was trying to make earlier about how difficult it is to assess somebody who is saying things, maybe even doing things that look like acts of preparation, and actually understanding whether that is a genuine threat and when to intervene is precisely what our day job is, together with MI5. And the more sources of information we can have on a person's background, thoughts, behaviours, the better. So the big lesson to learn is, and let's be honest, in policing we've learned this lesson a very long time ago. If you think about the way we deal with domestic abuse, the way we deal with violent, serious crime offenders in a multi-agency partnership, that is something that has been lacking in the terrorism space. So the biggest lesson learned was you need people, some of whose agencies sit outside of the national security community, to be brought within that data sharing and information sharing bubble to properly assess the threat. Now we're doing precisely that. In fact, we started long before Fishmongers Hall. It was one of the lessons learned from 2017, that how we mobilise partners as well as mobilising the public to help in the counter-terrorism threat. That community's defeat terrorism is not supposed to be a soundbite. It's an actual way of working. And some of those communities, local authorities, health, education, who fundamentally are not used to dealing with the kind of intelligence and are not vetted to deal with the kind of intelligence, but nevertheless hold lots of information of their own which might actually help us. The two-way communication process needs to be better. And Operation Semper is the operation that we set up back in 2018 to deal with that. I have to say in 2018, while we were dealing at the height of a terrorist and hostile state threat, priorities went on funding other operations at that time. That is very much post-Fishmongers Hall. A lot of work has gone into the data sharing agreements, the policy and process of sharing with those non-statutory security partners who have information, and setting up also within the secure prison estate dedicated teams to deal with the intelligence flows. So we now know exactly what cohort we're talking about, and they're not all tact offenders. So, obviously we use Achilles heel techniques to take out people that we think are of national security concern. So there are people sitting in the custody estate who are non-tact offenders who we think have got extremist or terrorist bent. There are people who start off in the secure estate who become radicalised within the secure prison estate, and we have a very close working relationship with HMPPS and their security arm, who have an excellent director who deals with my leads for Pursue, and we've set up a much better system. Now, what we want is one of the things we're asking the government for in the spending review is enough money to make a nationally consistent multi-agency process for dealing with terrorism. And Jonathan Hall's report has been incredibly good at underlining some of the need for that. So that's, you're right to call it out. We are addressing it. We are putting more in place.
I'll just wait until the division bell then. Thank you for that, Assistant Commissioner. I also think that data sharing and that cooperation across agencies is crucial, because in February you said that UK counter-terrorism policing has around 3,000 or so subjects of interest on its radar, in addition to convicted terrorists due to be released from prison, and that we simply cannot watch all of them all of the time. So what more in terms of bringing those partner agencies that aren't statutory on board can be done in order that these risks can be mitigated?
Well, precisely as I've described, that SEMPA is a model of multi-agency assessment around individuals where actually some of the risk mitigation won't be anything to do with pursuit. It won't be anything to do with covert operations by the UK intelligence community and counter-terrorism policing to prosecute an individual. Actually, catching people early at their stage of radicalisation is the most important thing we can do. Actually putting protective factors around them, which might be around the assessment of complex psychological needs, it might be in economics, it might be in housing, employment, social skills, but all of those things are equally important, and it's why, and I've often said this publicly when I was the deputy to this role as well as now, it's why PREVENT is the most important pillar of the counter-terrorism government strategy. And we have to be much more positive about how we talk about it and how we use it to divert the threat before it spins up into a threat to life. And I don't think we do enough about that. So one of the things within PREVENT, the statutory guidance in 2015 has hugely increased the number of referrals from education. And I think now education are in an excellent place where they understand the safeguarding responsibility of PREVENT. It's increased in health and is increasing in health, who understand the safeguarding responsibility in health. Where it fails is because of the way PREVENT has been talked about publicly is in friends and family. So we need to convince friends, families, people who are in communities who are going to be the first people to spot the signs of people being radicalised or moving towards radical thoughts, behaviours that might actually lead to terrorism, to have the confidence to refer people for help, because that's what it is. PREVENT was largely a voluntary system before desistance and disengagement programmes. Pause.
The PREVENT independent review has been delayed.
I've been calling for it. I'm in my 6th year of counter-terrorism, and I called for it, right at the start. And largely because what I wanted was a strong independent review that, in my view, would see the incredible good that is done at community level.
So given that, is it a problem that it's been delayed again?
I think that, yes, the delay is the problem, but I can understand. I'm not going to sit here with, at the stage we're in after the Prime Minister speaking last night about COVID and say, a bit like Sara, all of our day jobs have been flung to the right. What is important to me is I know there is a short list of good quality candidates. I know a successor will be chosen. I'm really delighted that a very strong director of PREVENT has been chosen by the Home Office who will start their new job. He's someone with great gravitas in Whitehall. He's somebody who's been a partner of mine for many years. It's proving to me that I think the Home Office are treating PREVENT in a very serious way. The Security Minister has given two excellent op-eds on it. I'd like to see more.
Diane Abbott. She's on mute, Diane. Diane, we can't hear you. It's muted.
Sorry.
Thank you.
My colleagues have touched on this, but I noticed that Sara Khan said earlier that this country doesn't have an effective counter-extremism strategy and the current approach isn't working. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, in fact, I think it's almost a direct quote from my illustrious predecessor, Sir Mark Rowley. He'd be horrified if I didn't agree with him in public. I think it is true, though, unfortunately. Everything Sara was talking about is in a space that I don't deal with, but is a space which, radicalises, and people who want to try and get people out of that space and into terrorism do straddle that line. So unless we have better join-up, I think, between PREVENT, counter-extremism, all of the multi-agency work I've just described, and the counter-terrorism portfolio, there are going to be gaps, and those gaps are being exploited by people who want to cause us harm. So, yes, I think we need a much more robust counter-extremism machine in the same way that we've spent decades developing the counter-terrorism machine.
Moving on, I'd like to ask you, in your opinion, how great a threat do returning foreign fighters pose to this country? And what processes do we have in place to monitor and address any threats returning foreign fighters and their partners, female partners in most cases, may pose?
It's a really good question. And back in 2016, it was probably the number one topic of conversation in the national security community, because we were really concerned at that time about the directed threat by Daesh, and indeed the threat that we had seen from Al-Qaeda previously, trying to get fully trained fighters back into the West to conduct attacks. And then 2015, France, Belgium, 2017, United Kingdom. But actually 70% of the attacks were domestic, homegrown people. So when we've looked at, but what we were doing in 2016 was preparing for the contingency that we might see the returning threat. So you should be reassured that every single person we know about has an operational plan against them. So we are monitoring, and let's be honest, we don't know where everybody is. We don't always have sources of intelligence that would allow us to do that. But everyone we know about effectively has a plan against them. And were they to come into this country and we were to stop or interdict them at a border, or we were to discover them in this country, they would be arrested and investigated by counter-terrorism policing. So that plan is in place for every single individual. The numbers are actually relatively small. The vast majority of people who left for war zones returned very quickly. Over half, I think, came back very quickly. Certainly between 40 and 50%. Largely because they had gone there because they thought a different life was on offer. They didn't realise it was going to be what it was. Some of them went for genuine humanitarian aid reasons. These are not people we considered a national security threat. The ones that remain, they've remained for a reason. And that reason, in my mind, can only be because they believe in the ideology, they believe in the violence, and they may have participated in it. That makes them highly dangerous. Now, I'm not making any distinction between gender or age in that. To me, they all have to be, and it's an unfortunate fact of life, but they all have to be treated as a threat by me until I know otherwise, which is why the investigation plan is set against each and every one of them. Now, I think every single one of them has to be treated on a case-by-case basis. So part of that returning plan includes all kinds of local authority support, child safeguarding support, psychological support. There is a full plan wrapped around them and family or any kind of foster care that minors, for instance, would have to go into. But it's a very good question. Hopefully I've reassured you that it's not one that we parked in 2016. It's one that we're still very much alive to.
Thank you.
So, any foreign fighter or their partner or wife that comes home will be arrested at the border?
It's highly likely. That doesn't mean necessarily that they will face a charge, because we have to look at the evidence that we have on a case-by-case basis. But any returning foreign fighter who has been fighting in a war zone, the evidence against them will be investigated by the police.
Thank you. Thank you. Tim Lawton.
Can I ask, on the subject of prescribing terrorist organisations, what impact does that have on police operational activity, and what impact do you think it has on recruitment for that organisation as well?
So you've hit the nail on the head. It's a double-edged sword. So prescription is a rare and difficult thing to get. So prior to National Action in 2016, British Union of Fascists in 1940 was the only other prescribed right-wing organisation. There are obviously a substantial number of prescribed organisations that are constantly checked. What prescription allows us to do in counter-terrorism policing, it brings them into the ambit of law enforcement and allows us to use tools, techniques and the law against members of those prescribed organisations. So at a relatively low level, simple membership, if we can prove it, would allow us to prosecute somebody rather than waiting for them to actually spin up into terrorist behaviour. So that's the usefulness of it, and that has proved remarkably useful with National Action, who I'm proud to say we have relatively dismantled and disrupted it. And it was my teams back in 2015 that put the case together for Amber Rudd to prescribe them in 2016. The prescription process, however, is quite bureaucratic.
Yeah.
So we have found with other prescribed organisations, by the time they're prescribed, we've already disrupted and dismantled them. So that is a problem, because their prescription, as you quite rightly say, could glorify them. It could make them a subject of interest, but then so does talking about them. So I come to a public hearing and I know I have to talk about them. I don't like talking about them, and I certainly don't like talking about individuals, because every time you do that, they don't care that I'm talking about them in a way that I want to arrest, prosecute and put them behind bars. To them, that's just any publicity is good publicity, and prescription is any publicity.
In terms of disruption against prosecution, have there been many people prosecuted purely on the grounds of their membership of the prescribed organisation rather than affiliated activity with it?
A number, but membership is very hard to prove. But it is useful legislation, so I absolutely do. I think I can't give you numbers off the top of my head, but if you consider National Action as an organisation was at most 80 to 100 strong when we started looking at it, 20 of those people have been prosecuted, and a number of those were for membership only.
Right, but it's the disruption activity that prescription aids that is actually probably more effective than that. Can I ask you about removal of citizenship? It's happened to about 150 people in the last 10 years. But there have been criticisms about its effectiveness in terms of you've now got on the loose, somewhere abroad, people who would do harm to this country. And also it's been criticised for an absence of some of the scrutiny of it as well. Do you think those criticisms are justified? Could the system be improved? Is it an important part of what you're trying to do?
So I can't really answer the scrutiny point. I think that's it's a political point about how the use of the power is scrutinised. Is the power useful, and does it help mitigate threat to UK residents within UK borders? The answer to that would be yes. So I don't think it's used. I think the fact that the numbers are relatively low, 150 over 10 years, I know the high point I think was 2018, where it was 21 in 1 year. But given the threats that we face and the potential we've just described in my answer to Diane Abbott, I think the government's strategic distance policy is important to keep this country safe, which is to keep fighters who have fought for Islamist terrorist causes or have fought in extremist circumstances out of this country. So I think it is important for that. The idea that they would somehow be loose abroad and that is they'd be better off behind bars here discounts the fact that it's sometimes incredibly difficult to prove the offences they've committed using evidence that would be admissible in a British court. It's often intelligence rather than evidence. So that is part of weighing up whether it is deprivation is the most important way of keeping the country safe.
Do you think
it's an important tactic?
Do you think there's an international role? Yeah, that we need something that doesn't go down the Guantanamo Bay route, and we need something that doesn't fall foul of the threshold of evidence in the UK. But we need to have an international body. We have an international body, but actually that would deal with what is a problem in limbo, clearly, with many of them in camps in Kurdish territory and in other informal settings as well, of which we don't know who's there in many cases, and we can't keep track of them. What actually is the solution to this several hundred or potentially several thousand problematic group?
So that's a great question, which is being debated at length within the national security community. I'd have to say that your comment about some form of international criminal court is the right one. There is obviously one of these in The Hague. One of my other responsibilities alongside hostile state activity is war crimes. So, we know just how difficult it is for international tribunals to be in this space, but that is one of the long-term options that needs to be considered.
Thank you.
Why has there been no action against the promotion of national action on BitChute?
So, BitChute is... I was listening to Sara about that, and I'm not aware of the piece of extremist propaganda being reported to us that actually promotes national action. That, in my view, would be something I'd want to be sitting down with Max Hill and saying, does that cross the TAC threshold? I'd be surprised if it didn't, so I'd want to investigate that. So the short answer is I can't answer that question, but I'd want to investigate it. The BitChute was a really interesting conversation because other than the top 6 major providers, Sara very kindly said the stuff at the CTIRU, the Counter-Terrorism Internet Referral Unit, take down, but it's actually a voluntary process. We can only work in taking down extremist material because the companies actually cooperate with us. We point out what needs to be taken down. We've assisted in public messaging to get the public to report things, and then they go about with their processes and technology taking the stuff down. There are many other providers, and BitChute is an example of it, and Sara quoted others who want nothing to do with law enforcement, wouldn't cooperate.
Does the fact that BitChute is registered here make that easier, though? Are there any additional powers that you have to be able to pursue it because it's UK registered?
No, there was a really good question about not if they're crossing legal thresholds. So if they're breaking the law and they're registered here, that's absolutely within our jurisdiction. So that's not an issue. The stuff that they're promoting, which Sara was talking about in the hateful extremism, the line between free speech, a lot of these platforms will do the same thing and then, as Sara described, hide behind freedom of speech to then effectively promote stuff that may or may not cross the lawful threshold. But the bar is set very, very high by the Crown Prosecution Service, as you know, and quite rightly in some respects. We're a liberal democracy, but some of it, that I would find egregious is still, not unlawful.
It would be really helpful if you could look further into the issue about the promotion of national action.
I've made a note of it.
And write to us on that one, because that does look, even if there's obviously a clear case in terms of changing the law on some of these issues, that would look to be something that should be covered by current law. And it would be very helpful for us to know whether it is either not covered by current law and therefore the gap is wider than we would think, or alternatively whether there is some sort of system gap in terms of the identification of this kind of material and then the further prosecution and pursuit of it.
So I have offered the Commissioner help in that space.
Great.
So any cases we've got that we've not been able to prosecute would be evidence for a future.
Thank you. It would be very helpful if you could write to us further on where you conclude. Ruth Edwards.
Thank you, Chair. Commander Basu, I'd like to talk a bit about de-radicalisation. Given that we've had some terrorist attack perpetrators, such as the Fishmongers Hall attacker, who have participated in de-radicalisation programmes and then gone on to commit attacks, how effective do you feel our current de-radicalisation programmes are?
So it's, de-radicalisation and de-system programmes, they're run by the Joint Extremism Unit, so it's a government-run programme, which that question might be better directed at them. I wouldn't take one single example to say that D&DP programmes are not useful. So I think any society is going to need something like that. The fact is we've been very successful at arresting and locking up terrorists, but a lot of those come out eventually. And unless there is some way of, and of course D&DP is a mandatory, I like to call it second chances. We used to talk about prevent as being a voluntary safeguarding role, and it is, but part of the prevent work now has to be to give people who have been radicalised, who have become terrorists, a second chance of reintegrating with society, because there is no other choice. They will be in our communities. So I think it's important. How good they are, I don't know, because I've not seen a public evaluation of the process. I know we are working towards that, and certainly our own multi-agency processes, which are very similar because they involve intervention providers who do talk about ideological training effectively, and ideological intervention to talk about a counter-narrative. We're having those assessed as well. So incredibly important to do it. How effective are they? They've only been running for 4 years. They'll be needed for generations to come, in my view. So we need to start putting some evaluation behind it, finding out what works and taking it forward. And I think the UK has a potential to be a global leader in this space. When I talk about managing terrorists in the community, I can't find anywhere in the world that has a gold standard of how they do this.
That's very interesting, particularly your comments about how we haven't really we don't have any sort of great benchmarks overseas to look at either. As somebody who investigates these people, who spends a lot more time trying to understand their mindset than many of us, how do you think we could even begin to start to de-radicalise people who are motivated enough to commit these attacks, given that what we're essentially trying to do is not like in other forms of rehabilitation in prison where we're trying to help people off drugs or alcohol or whatever. We are effectively trying to change someone's entire worldview, which is so poisoned with hatred against our society that they want to kill people in our society. I mean, I find it very, as a layperson, it's very difficult to understand how we would even begin doing that, and I'd be really interested in your views.
So it's incredibly hard to do. So once they've crossed that Rubicon and they've reached the level that you've described, trying to change someone's mind is incredibly difficult, because these aren't people. A layperson might look at it and think, well, clearly somebody like Salman Abedi and his brother must have been mentally disturbed to commit an atrocity that egregious. How could anybody? I mean, I've been in policing for 28 years and I couldn't understand it, to be frank. But they weren't mad. They think they're morally right. So, trying to change somebody's mind who feels that way is an incredibly difficult thing to do. I don't know, because I'm not a qualified clinical psychologist or psychiatrist, how you would go about that. The interesting thing when you mention drugs and alcohol is there is an analogy, I think, that the only way you can get people off drugs and alcohol, generally speaking, is if they want to. Effectively this is a voluntary process of de-radicalisation. You can't mandate it. Mandating somebody to change their mind, in my view, somebody who is in the kind of space that you've described, is impossible. So actually, for me, the only way to cure this long term is right at the start of the journey. So Sara said something really interesting, which I've been talking about for core policing, which is actually a wider issue about introducing the concept of rules-based order and law in primary school. When I was dealing with gangland crime many years ago, one of the problems I had was by the time we dealt with an offender, it was too late. And one of the depressing things about that is those offenders they weren't in their early 20s anymore, they were becoming 16, 17 and 18-year-olds. Now I've got 12, 13, 14-year-olds, both in the gangland space and in terrorism. So how do we intervene and safeguard people long before they even get sucked into this radical? That's where a lot more effort has to go in. The Desistance and Disengagement Programme, it's just over 100 people have been through that programme. We've already said there are 3,000 active terrorists, and there are many more who've been a national security concern in the past. If we want to stop that becoming the problem for my successor's successor, it is prevent at the earliest age, which is the only thing I think will succeed.
Yeah, and do we have any estimate of how many sort of young people, you're talking about 13, 14-year-olds, are getting sort of sucked in to extremism?
I wouldn't want to give a professional estimate. A lot of my stuff is anecdotal because it's actually in my casework. So I could give you a breakdown of the age of offenders. And the average age is... So most terrorist offenders will be 30 or less and male. I can give you that as a definitive statistic. What has been disturbing is the number that are becoming much younger. It's still small. If I showed you the figures, you'd go, well, that's not much. But the worrying thing is the trajectory is downwards in age terms. So I think Sara worried me when she talked about the prevalence of young people and extremism. There's definitely one of the things you were talking about is how is that happening? Well, it's grooming online. So some of those open spaces, which are legitimate platforms that probably many people who are listening to this use every day, the radicalisers will start on that platform and lure you onto the BitChutes and the 4chans and the 8chans of the future, and that's where they will, or into the closed groups, the encrypted groups, and that's where they'll groom you. And that is happening younger because, A, they're tech savvy and they're on these things, and they are on open platforms which are not policed, to be frank.
Thank you. Stuart MacDonald.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Assistant Commissioner. We can't let you go without asking you about Brexit, and can I ask then, how are preparations for the potential loss of access to tools such as the European Arrest Warrant, passenger name records and SIS2?
So we are stitched into all of the relevant government committees that are discussing this. I think you've taken evidence from Richard Martin several times, good colleague of mine, who set up the ICCC, which was the organisation that was there to help policing mitigate any problems from the loss of those tools you've described. I'm in a slightly different space from core policing and the National Crime Agency because I'm a low volume user of those tools. So the mitigations Richard Martin has put in place will be incredibly helpful, but they will be slower and clunkier, and they do affect some of my investigations. So I can't tell you that crashing out with no deal and no security deal isn't a risk. It very clearly is a risk. We would not be as safe as we are today. So we're obviously encouraging the negotiations to give us a security treaty that gives us as many of those tools or access to those tools as possible. The ones you've described are of real concern to me. So SIS-2, Sienna, the European arrest warrant, these things are very important, and of course passenger name records couldn't be more important. Those issues we've made very clear. I've spoken about it publicly that they are operationally effective for us. But of course I have the advantage in national security that we can deal bilaterally with countries. They're not bound by EU regulations whilst dealing with national security. My difficulty is I can't negotiate a mitigation with those countries until the final government negotiations are done. So the longer they take to negotiate the treaty, the shorter period of time I'm going to have to potentially renegotiate 27 bilateral treaties to exchange information. What I do know is every single one of those countries recognises that the UK is a world leader in this space and that they need our intelligence as much as we need theirs for Europe to be a safe space. So I'm not anticipating any country turning around and saying, I won't share with you. The one caveat to that is the data adequacy argument that is going on at the moment. The UK will have to prove that it's got the systems and processes that allow it to process European data adequately. I'm as caught by that as any other organisation.
Thank you. We're short of time, so you might want to, if you can, write with answers to some of this. But can you give us just a flavour of the sort of contingencies and alternatives that have been put in place, even for the particular systems that you mentioned there as being important to your work, like SIS-2, Sienna, PNR, and EAW?
So on EAW, the European arrest warrant was a great step forward for policing in this country, allowing us to arrest on the basis of a case put by another country whose legal system we approved of. That is being replaced by Interpol notices, so we'll go back to Interpol notices to do that. The extradition is the other issue. That is being replaced by or going back to the old 1957 Act, so that will be much slower. On the Interpol notices, I believe Richard was negotiating an arrest power for Interpol red notices, so that we don't have to go for a warrant where we stop someone who is subject to an Interpol red notice. We can arrest them there and then. So there are a couple of the systems. The SIS-2 stuff, the Interpol database, that is an issue for national security because the Interpol database is much larger than the SIS-2 database. It goes to countries we ordinarily wouldn't deal with. So there are complications in sharing data in that way that we will need to work through. That, to avoid me having to write to you, that's a short synopsis. Passenger name records, I think there's legislation that will allow us to continue receiving PNR information.
In terms of SIS-2, you mentioned the issues that you would have of sharing information on Interpol instead, but the other way around, I mean, I know it's hundreds of millions of times that police in the United Kingdom search that database every year. How important is that for you and your work, and where are you going to get that information from if you don't have direct access to SIS-2?
So we have those bilateral arrangements with those countries, and we have two accesses. We have the intelligence community dealing with the intelligence community, and I have a network of police officers who are established internationally who will have third country status and will still have access on a bilateral basis with individual countries. So we won't be invited, we won't be in the room in Europol anymore, but as I said, I'm a low volume user. I mean, if Lynn Owens or Martin Hewitt or Cress was sitting here for wider policing, they're in a much more difficult problem than I am. But overall, We need a security treaty that gives us as much access as we can to the tools and techniques that we've got today. That would be my bottom line.
And finally, passenger name record, is that again an issue of trying to come to bilateral arrangements with member states?
It is, but of course that is incredibly important for the security of our borders, full stop. It's not just a CT issue. That is something that's absolutely required, yes.
Okay, but you're saying that can't be done until after the end of the transition period, so there is a potential gap before that work can even begin?
Right, I'm not the expert on that, Richard Martin is, so I will leave that for his answer. We have an operational requirement, we've made that operational requirement very clear to the negotiators, and we will need that information for our security in the future.
So if we lose passenger name records and SIS2, does that mean we won't know who is arriving in the country and we won't be able to check them against whether they're wanted in other European countries for any extremism-related activity?
We will be if those European countries have uploaded their SIS2 information onto the Interpol database.
How many so far have done so?
I don't know. But that's Richard Martin's. I mean, I would be foolish to assume that they would see the same urgency as I would.
And in terms of these bilaterals that you said you would need to negotiate if there isn't a full agreement on it, would those bilaterals, would that also allow you to exchange evidence that you can use in criminal prosecutions, or would it just be about exchanging intelligence?
It would be evidence as well.
And how far have you got in preliminary sort of pre-talks in case those bilaterals are needed?
We've not been able to have any of those pre-talks. I can kind of understand the government's position as in you don't want to interfere with the negotiation. So we have only been cooperating with our European partners on an operational basis so far. We've not been negotiating at all around future bilateral arrangements.
And then final question from me. Are you confident that legally it can be done to establish those bilateral arrangements as opposed to whatever political agreements might be reached? Can it legally be done?
Yes, under the European Treaty, yes.
Thank you. Assistant Commissioner, thank you very much for your evidence. We very much appreciate it today, and thank you again to you and all of your officers for the work that you are doing to keep the country safe. Thank you.
Order. Has ended.